Hey everybody, my YouTube channel turns 15 years old today. I figured I would celebrate by doing an often requested video. People want me to rate all of the culprits in the Nancy Drew series. So that's what I'm gonna do. This video is going to contain spoilers, so if you don't want me to spoil the identity of the culprits, then don't watch the video. We're gonna start with game number 1. The Secrets Can Kill. So the culprit in that game is Mitch Dillon, and I don't think he's a very good culprit because he doesn't show up until 1 minute before the end of the game. He's very much introduced at the last moment. Now, he is intimidating in that he's a murderer, he's a drug dealer, and he carries a gun. That's basically what his role is. He's just supposed to be a big, scary person. We don't get a sense of his personality or his motivation or anything like that. So, in terms of being scary, yes. In terms of being like an effective culprit who fits the story, no. Like, it might even have been better if the remastered version of the game made Daryl Gray the culprit, or made Hulk the culprit, one of the actual characters. Now, the remastered version changes the culprit to Mitch Dillon's partner, Detective Beach, and it's an unsatisfying ending because Nancy's like, well, who was Detective Beach? I don't know. He was using a fake name all along. Why did he want those documents? I don't know. Never figured it out. Yeah, that was really an unsatisfying... Yeah, I didn't really like Detective Beach as a character very much. Like, if he wasn't the culprit, then he would be entirely forgettable. And I feel the same way about several culprits of the Nancy Drew series, but I'm getting ahead of myself. So with The Secrets Can Kill, both the original and the remastered version, the culprit is on the lower end, like a 2 or a 3 out of 10. On the other hand, game number 2, Stay Tuned for Danger, like 10 out of 10, great culprit. Dwayne Powers was an amusing character, and especially at the end, where he goes completely over the top dramatic, like he's a soap opera villain. I do also like the scene where he kills Nancy, where he goes while choking her to death. That's super frightening and scary. I just really liked that. So, game number 3, Dwayne Powers, thumbs up. Game number 3, about halfway, Louis Chandler. I don't think he's a particularly interesting character. He's one of the ones where if he was not the culprit, then he would easily be the least memorable character of the game. He doesn't really do much. He's kind of annoying when he talks to you. He looks down on you the whole time. And he can get Nancy kicked out of the mansion for looking at a book, and it's a library, okay? It's a library room, and he's like, you looked at a book that I looked at! I will have you ejected! Now, I do like, it kind of comes out of nowhere where Louis just attacks Nancy. It's like, oh, the gold is mine now, ha 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 ha. Too bad no one will ever find out about it. That's specifically what he says. Thwap. I do like how Nancy defeats Louis Chandler by dropping a chandelier on his head. That's kind of cute. But other than that, I don't think he makes for a very effective culprit. Game number 4 is Treasure in a Royal Tower. Lisa Ostrom is sort of like Louis. I don't think she would be memorable if not for the fact that she's the culprit, because all the other characters in the game are far more interesting and they've got stories. But Lisa pretty much just sits in her chair the whole game. She lies about knowing Spanish, and at one point she tells you to get a medallion in the shed. That's basically her only contribution to the plot before the big reveal that she's the culprit. I do kind of like the corniness of the ending, where she sprays you with spicy devil villain venom, I think it's called. It's so silly that she just drops a really long, complicated name when she sprays Nancy. And it's also kind of silly where Nancy says, well, why are you doing this? And Lisa's like, haven't you heard? It's a material world, and I am a material girl. So those are lyrics from a 1980s song. I guess maybe Lisa watched the music video too many times growing up. That's also kind of silly. But, you know, at the very end where she's like, oh, darn you, Nancy Drew, you're the worst friend a diamond thief could have. It's like, wow, that was very weak. I did not like this. So overall, Lisa's just like, not so good. Game number 5, the final scene, has a fantastic ending. Joseph is an interesting villain because it seems like he doesn't know he's the villain. He seems to go in and out of it because he's revealed as the villain, and he still thinks the theater is going to be okay. He's talking about painting the lobby, almost like he doesn't know that, hey, I've got somebody held captive, and I'm also going to murder Nancy here. There is the moment at the end where he's like, not so fast, Nancy. We're going down in a blaze of glory. Yeah, at the very end, and then you just defeat him by throwing flash paper at him. Yeah, I'd say the ending, like the real danger from the ending comes from the fact that the building's going to be demolished. It doesn't really come from the culprit. And that might weaken his effectiveness as a culprit. But, I mean, that's clearly, they were trying something different. I mean, Joseph is a sympathetic culprit. I still feel bad for him at the end of the game. And, you know, he was really nice during the entire game. So I say he's okay. You know, I liked him better than definitely Lisa or Lewis, for sure. But he's definitely not over-the-top, evil, scheming mastermind like Dwayne Powers. No, Joseph is more, you know, just he got in way over his head, and he was not cut out for a life of crime, as Nancy says at the end. Game number 6, Secret of Scarlet Hand. Now, I know a lot of people don't like the ending to this game because, you know, all the characters are there and they do nothing while Nancy's locked inside the monolith. But I really do like the ending to the game. You know, I just complained about Lisa going, darn you, Nancy Drew. But Taylor Sinclair has the exact same thing, where he's looking up at the camera and waving his hands, and he goes, confound you, Nancy Drew! And that's it! That's the drama that Lisa was lacking. Oh, and Taylor is just a fun character overall. I'm really glad he's the culprit. He's one of the characters where it's like, oh man, I really wish he was the culprit. You know, that's why I thought when playing this game, because he's already like a mean character that I dislike. And you could go to other games, it's like, gosh, you know, wouldn't the final scene have been amazing if Simone was the culprit? Could you imagine Nancy and Simone trading insults when Simone reveals she's the culprit all along? Ooh, that would be cool! And it's sort of the same thing with Taylor Sinclair. It's like, oh, wouldn't it be cool if he was the culprit? He is! Yes! Oh, well, who'd you expect? The Tooth Fairy? Throws cookies at Nancy. Throws moldy cookies at Nancy. He does not throw moldy cookies at her, but that would have been funny if he had. Game number 7, Ghost Dogs of Moon Lake. You know, I have complained that Ghost Dogs of Moon Lake needs another character. And that sort of is a problem with the culprits. Like, well, who was going to be the culprit of the game? Well, it can't be Ranger Akers. And Red Knot kind of wouldn't work as a culprit either. So the culprit kind of has to be Emily by default. I don't think she really works that well. I mean, she's, again, a character who was nice to Nancy all along, sort of like Joseph. But in this case, you know, unlike Joseph, it's like that was very much a fake, a facade. She was only pretending to be friendly. But the end of the game is sort of, she pops up out of nowhere. She's like, hi, Nancy, I've got a bone, and now I'm going to attack you. Yeah. And, yeah, just overall did not think that her picture, she looks weird at the ending, too, that where she's revealed as the culprit. So the graphics are a little off, so that's also something which makes me I don't like that culprit reveal. I do have to give her points for having a very complicated, well thought out plan with training the dogs and everything. Like, that is a lot of effort to be doing that for months and months. Although I still find it weird the ghost dogs only attack once. You'd think she would have attacked. She also did, like, knock Nancy out and lock her in a burning building, and that was scary, right? I thought that was scarier than the ending when Emily comes after you with a big dog bone. Probably because Emily is sort of not there in that scene, right? You get to move around in the little sewer areas, all puzzles and stuff like that. Well, not too much of a puzzle, but you don't really see Emily. It's just, okay, the area looks the exact same it did before Emily was here. You don't really get a sense of danger from the environment like you did when the shed was on fire. Okay, talked enough about that. Game number 8, The Haunted Carousel. Oh, I should also say, shout out to Maggie Bittner, who is the most recent person to tell me to make this video. I've gotten lots of people who requested me to make culprit rankings over the years, and you know, she was the most recent one when I was asking, what should I do for my YouTube channel? Because, you know, this is year 15. It's the 15th birthday of the Argle Thumps channel. Also, I hit 55,000 subscribers this year. Recently hit 75 million views. So I had lots of reason to celebrate. That's why I'm making this big celebration video. I asked people, hey, how should I celebrate? And everybody loved Maggie's suggestion to make this culprit ranking video. So shout out to Maggie. Sorry, I totally forgot to give your shout out at the start of the video. Okay, back to the Haunted Carousel. I like the culprit in the Haunted Carousel. I think the Haunted Carousel is one of my favorite games because it's the first Nancy Drew game I ever played. And it really works well with Elliot, the way that the story just goes towards him. I don't think Joy would have worked as the culprit. Maybe Harlan. I like Harlan. I didn't want him to be the culprit, but just the way the plan works, it has to be him. I feel like that's the case with also game number 23. It's like, well, if we're following things correctly, then this person absolutely has to be the villain because, you know, the culprit is doing art smuggling, making replicas, and that fact alone means that Elliot, the art guy, has to be the culprit. If it had been the case that the culprit was going after the hidden jewels, then maybe it could have been someone else, but no, it has to be Elliot because he's only the art guy. And it kind of works because he's first introduced as sort of, he gets angry at you at first. The first time you meet him, he's like, out, get out. He doesn't say it that angrily, but you know, you get a sense that he's got a nastier side to his personality, even though he's relatively nice throughout the entire game. He does have that mean edge to him, which comes back at the very end, so I thought that was well done. I also think it's really scary, the game over sequences where he attacks you. That's really scary. And the next game continues with that, with game number 9, the one that takes place in Washington. Danger on Deception Island, that's it, with Andy Jason. Really scary ending where he like attacks Nancy and chokes her. Also scary where he's got Katie held captive. That was really scary too. Yeah, could somebody else have been the culprit? I'm not sure. No, I think it works well to have Andy as the culprit. I know some people think it would have been better to have Katie as the culprit, and you know, I would have been totally fine with the game had Katie been the culprit, but Andy works for, he works really well as the, you know, that pretending that Katie's the culprit at the end, that's a good fake out. I think Andy makes a good culprit. I still don't understand why he brings Nancy to the culprit's boat when he's the culprit. Like, why did he do that? He's already kidnapped Katie at this point, right? Why doesn't he just knock Nancy out and kidnap her too? Like, why does he purposely get her on his boat in such a way that she can totally foil his plan? It doesn't make sense. So in terms of culprit planning, that doesn't make sense. He's not very smart in that terms. It is like poetic justice that the orca whale defeats him because, you know, he runs the whale watching place. You know, so it works. You know, the whale that he was mistreating the whale and forcing it to get a bunch of stolen cargo, and you know, so it's also poetic justice in that way that, you know, the key part of his plan ends up being the thing that destroys him. So yeah, Andy Jason's just, I guess he's okay, but his plan at the end just kind of falls apart. And did I give rankings for the other ones? So yeah, I did like the Haunted Carousel's villain. Yeah. Okay, game number 10, Secret of Shadow Ranch. Oh, Shorty makes for a great villain. I think Tex also would have been a great villain, but that's it. I don't think Dave would have been a villain, and I don't think Mary Yazi would have been a villain either. But yeah, Shorty is kind of unexpected. He's mostly a fun character throughout the entire game, except when he's making you pick vegetables, which is terrible. I do not like his vegetable challenges. It's funny because the other weekend, my dad, he's growing a vegetable garden, and he's like, hey, you want to check out my vegetable garden? He wants to show it off. And then I started making all sorts of jokes about Secret of Shadow Ranch, and nobody in my family got it. They all looked at me like I was crazy. So I'm like, okay, fine, whatever. So I already had like a fair bit of anger built up for Shorty already because of the vegetable stuff. But yeah, I think the culprit reveal really works. He does manage to be super intimidating. It's like he can be really scary there at the end. And I do like when Nancy defeats him and he just goes back to being manipulative. He's like, oh, Nancy, you wouldn't leave me down here. You're too nice to do a thing like that. It's like, Shorty, Nancy's not going to fall for your two-faced lies. Yeah, so Shorty was definitely a good culprit. Game number 11. Oh, is that Curse of Blackmoor Manor? I think it's Curse of Blackmoor Manor. I don't know. I don't think Jane was a good culprit. I mean, surprise culprit, definitely. That's something, some people really like the surprise culprits. I prefer the culprits that make a lot of sense, because I was just complaining about Andy Jason not making sense. Shorty made sense. We know that he's after the gold in those hills, So, I mean, there's adequate setup for Shorty being the culprit. As opposed to surprise culprits, I tend not to like. It feels more like they pulled a name out of a hat, and it's like, oh, this person's the culprit. I pulled their name out of the hat, they're the culprit. So I don't really like the surprise culprits. Like Jane, there was a lot of thought put into it. Like, there's quite a bit of explanation at the end of the game as to how that works. But I'll be honest, like, Linda couldn't have been the culprit. We never really saw her in the game. Mrs. Drake would have been an interesting culprit. Yeah, because, she's... Let's see, her brother was Alan. Yeah, so she could be mad that he was led to be part of the group, the Pendleton family conspiracy, as it were. But she wasn't, and maybe she harbors resentment because of that, and maybe she's purposely trying to get rid of Linda because she wants to inherit the mansion herself. And the game definitely leads you to believe that could be the case, and it would have worked perfectly. Now, it could have also worked had Ethel been the culprit. She's super creepy. And I feel like in that case, it would have been she is just super protective of the Pendleton family secret, and she tries to capture Nancy because she doesn't want Nancy to break their centuries-long tradition. So I thought that would have been good. I don't think if Ethel had been the culprit, it would have been that she's... Yeah, no. It would have been so creepy. She's like, well, you discovered our secret. I tried to warn you, Nancy. Now you must die. Like, oh, that would have been so good. But instead we got Jane, who, and the ending is not the culprit trying to kill Nancy. The ending is Nancy saving Jane, the culprit, because she is a little child. And so, yeah, Ethel would have been so much better. I would have gone with Ethel or Mrs. Drake as the culprit long before Jane. You could still keep up the storyline that maybe Jane was sabotaging Linda, but yeah, I don't know. I don't think Jane worked as an overall culprit in the game. She's like one of the few like nice, sympathetic characters. Nigel, he would not have worked as the culprit. So Nigel feels a lot like Louis Chandler did in game number 3. He's just the guy who's doing research in the library and is not really directly attached to anything going on in the game. And so had Nigel been the culprit, I feel like it would have been just like game number 3, where Louis was the culprit. And it would have been just like, oh, okay, well that happened. I mean, at least Jane is very unexpected as a culprit because she's... How old is she anyway? 10 to 12 years old? I'm not sure. Well, Yeah, so she's not one of my favorite culprits, but I do like the game. I do like the game, and I don't think that her being the culprit is so bad that it ruins the game. Next game, Secret of the Old Clock. We kind of have two culprits in that game, and I kind of wish there was only one. If Richard Topham had been the main culprit all along, that would have been just fine. I would have been totally okay with that. Instead, he's sort of relegated to side culprit, as the real culprit ends up being Jane. Two culprits named Jane in a row. That's weird. Yeah, and her plan makes very little sense. So she impersonates somebody she's never met to pretend to be the guardian, so she can convince Emily. So she can convince Emily to sell. I don't know. Her plot was a little too complicated. It seems weird that she would go impersonate someone for months on end. She really did a good job of making Emily think she was going crazy. So she did have an effective plot, but it is interesting how some of these culprits have really long, involved plots. Just like the Ghost Dogs of Moon Lake, where Emily's plan must have been in effect for months, right? And the same with Secret of the Old Clock. Emily's plan must have been in effect for months. So definitely points for planning and really committing to a long-term evil plan. However, I don't really think she makes for a good culprit. And the culprit reveal is, "See you later, sister," and then she just drives off. And we don't get much beyond that. Like, the end of letter explanation is really what we get. That's not a very satisfying culprit confrontation. You know, it's the same with, like, Jane. Nancy doesn't talk to Jane very much when Jane is the culprit. Jane basically gives some exposition, and then the thing falls down from the ceiling. And then that's it. It's not like a back-and-forth conversation like some of the other games where Nancy gets a fair chance to talk to the culprit. Like, you know, Stay Tuned for Danger. She got to talk to Dwayne. There was a bit of back and forth. You got to pick dialogue options, which I really like. Some of these endings we don't get a lot. You don't get to pick dialogue options. It's basically we see the scene and Nancy says what she's gonna say. You don't really have an effect over what gets said. Yeah. So Secret of the Old Clock's villain. Last Train to Blue Moon Canyon is an interesting one because, as some people pointed out, there's really no crime committed until the very end of the game where the culprit's revealed, where Lori reveals she was secretly planning to get this valuable letter all along. And she just sort of on the spot decides to turn evil and murder Nancy. There is a little bit of foreshadowing where she's like, "Hey, Nancy, you're gonna be in trouble if you find something and don't tell me." Her voice like changes and gets into and she uses her angry voice, shall we say. And that's sort of before, that's almost immediately before Nancy gets dropped off in Blue Moon Canyon. So that is so there is a bit of foreshadowing with that culprit. Yeah, I'd say she was a good culprit. I feel like it worked. I guess the culprit could have been, I don't know, I don't think the culprit really, I think she really works as the culprit in that game. But as I said, her culprit plot doesn't really come into play until the very end. Like the stuff with her fake kidnapping herself that was just her being funny and trying to make people excited, but it wasn't real culprit intentions or evil. Yeah, it feels like, gosh, you know, if Nancy had found that letter 1 minute sooner, then there would be no crime and there would be no culprit. Yeah, what would happen is the letter would be revealed and Lori would try to take all the credit for it. I'm sure everybody else, Tino would try to take all the credit for it too. Yeah, and then, you know, the author wouldn't have paid any attention whatsoever. I'm not sure what John Gray would have done. Yeah. Anyway, game number 14, Danger by Design. Thumbs down for the culprits being Ernst and Gunther Schmeck, who are characters that never get mentioned in the game. There's one newspaper article about them, but it's very easy to miss. And they get introduced at the very end, so it's like, haha, they were the bad guys all along. Who are they? What? That was really terrible. And they're just cartoonishly, they cartoonishly bad villains. too, so I didn't like that at all. Minette, I liked Minette as the villain. That was really good to have Minette as the villain, and then the revelation of her having a tattoo underneath her mask, that was really cool. Some people thought it was, again, too cartoony, where Nancy has to fight Minette at the end of the game, but Nancy doesn't actually throw a punch, and they trade insults with each other. I thought it was an okay end-of-game puzzle, but did feel sort of... I don't know, the problem is that it's not connected to the storyline that Nancy just went through, which is finding Noisette Tournaud's old stained glass windows that she hid from the war. And Minette knows nothing about it, she cares nothing about it, and so that's kind of weird that Minette, the main culprit, is separated from this big plot that Nancy spends a lot of the game trying to solve. But Minette definitely works as a culprit. I like her in that role. I'm not sure who else would have been a good culprit. Dieter, maybe? No, I mean, Dieter's the only one who knows about the stolen artwork, so therefore he's like the biggest option for who the culprit could be. Yeah. Okay, game number 15. Oh, Creature of Kapu Cave. Oh, man. Yeah, I do not like the culprit reveal in that game at all. But who would have been a better culprit? I think the problem is the story just makes no sense, and it's just and that's, oh gosh, Big Island Mike and Pua were the culprits all along, and they're spraying beetle pheromones into the trees to destroy the pineapple crop. It's just... It doesn't make sense. Yeah, if the game had a real culprit, like somebody who had actual criminal intentions, that would be better, instead of... Gosh. Yeah. Maybe... Yeah. I don't know. Maybe the really angry guy, Malachi Craven. Dr. Craven might have been a culprit. I don't know. Like, Nancy and the Hardys are basically solving two separate games at the same time. They're playing two separate games at the same time. That's sort of what it feels like. And the storylines don't connect. And just because the game wasn't thought out, the storyline with the culprits wasn't thought out, that the culprits are not good in that game. Like, I could see this game being rewritten so Big Island Mike does make for an interesting villain, or Pua makes for a good villain. That would have worked just fine. I'm not sure Dr. Kim would have worked as a good villain. Yeah, why would she sabotage herself? That would be the question. But then again, she does want Nancy to break into the top secret facility, and Dr. Kim has done that in the past, so maybe, I don't know. Creature Kapu Cave is kind of not a good game. One of the, worst Nancy Drew games. And that, yeah, so that really hurts the culprit stuff. Okay, White Wolf of Icicle Creek. Yanni's okay for the culprit. The culprit, like at the very end, they try to do the same sort of thing where it's like, oh man, the culprit is totally Lou. Take a look, we've got his bag. But then Yanni instantly reveals himself as the culprit, like a minute later. They don't really hold on to the Lou is the culprit fake out for very long, as opposed to Danger on Deception Island, where they hold on to the Katie is the culprit fake out for quite a bit of time. I mean, it's not a huge amount of time, but it's at least 5 minutes, much longer than the Yanni's the culprit. And the revelation of Yanni is the culprit also comes with a pretty clunky bit of exposition where Nancy's like, oh, hey, Isis just dropped the glove, which means the scent on the glove, which belongs to Yanni, matches the scent on the geo thing that he's always wearing around his arm. And, oh my gosh, the numbers on this mean that it's about to explode. And while she's saying that, the timer goes down to like 30, 29, 28, 27. I'm always like, Nancy, if you know it's going to explode, just don't talk about it, run! It feels like maybe there was supposed to be like a little bit of gameplay in between you finding the Lou stuff and then Yanni going for help. Like that would have been okay if there was like, like a minor puzzle or something in between those two things. Chasing Yanni in the snow, that's really not a good end game puzzle. I don't like it. It's better than Fox and Geese, which is a terrible puzzle in that game. But overall, Yanni makes for a perfectly serviceable culprit. I don't like how the explanation is he was secretly getting uranium for unknown purposes. Secret government spy, and that's all we hear about the matter. That's a lot like the Secrets Can Kill Remastered, where it's like, well, what was he doing? Well, we don't really know. Some sort of drug spy thing, maybe? I feel like that lessens the effectiveness of him as the culprit. Yeah. It also seemed, I don't know. It's okay. It's okay, but I feel like the culprit could have been better in that game, definitely. Yeah, I think maybe Lou, because the game sort of set up that. I mean, both Lou and Guadalupe, it was introduced, they had actual reasons and motivations, whereas Yanni's motivation is not introduced until that spot at the very end, which is weird because he did have a good motivation for being secretive, and he's saying he's got enemies everywhere, and yeah, like, if that had been his main motivation, I think that probably would have made me like the game more, or at least I would have accepted him more as a culprit, whereas instead, it's like, well, we're just gonna switch his motivation. He's actually a top secret spy the whole time. I feel like that lessens his plan. Yeah. Okay, that's game number 16. 17, Legend of the Crystal Skull. Really good. I actually like that. That's one of those games where I feel like anyone could have been the culprit. Maybe not Lamont, but if Dr. Buford had been the culprit, that would have worked just fine. If Henry had been the culprit, that probably would have worked just fine too. Yeah, but I think Renee did a good job as the culprit. So with those other people, if they'd been the culprit, it would have been their motivation is to steal the crystal skull. Yeah, whereas Renee's motivation works for her character, which is that she thinks it's some part of weird alien conspiracy where she's going to bring the skulls together and they'll tell the secrets of the universe. And she's so unrepentant about killing Dr. Bollet and about pretty much leaving Nancy to die. It, like Nancy says, it feels good when she's arrested. It is very satisfying to see her get captured, and all of her stuff is well explained. She does make for an intimidating villain too. She does come across as, kind of not all there too at the end, where she's just like going on and on about the crystal skulls. But I think that worked. I think that worked well, especially because we've got some stuff with Professor Hotchkiss earlier on, which sort of, balances that and foreshadows that as well. And plus, we always knew that, Renee was deeply involved in hoodoo and other stuff. That's very well established. So, that's good. Oh, man. Game number 18. Or is it 17? No, 18. Phantom of Venice. Hard one to... Because there's so many culprits, right? We have the Phantom Gang, and we pretty much know all of them are culprits the entire time. So it's no surprise that Fongo and Enrico are culprits, as well as Gina, or Scaramuccia, I think she was. Gina, yeah, we don't really see her get arrested, do we? Or the Phantom, the Phantom, we knew who was the culprit. I'm sorry. Anyway, the Phantom Gang works fine. We don't really see much of Nico or Gina. We don't really see her ever. We don't see too much of Fongo either. Like, we hear him talk a little bit, and we see him in his office, but that's about it. Yeah. So, they're okay as culprits. In terms of, like, the suspects, the person at the Canos Costa who's the culprit, I didn't really like Helena as the culprits. I thought that was a situation where they just drew a name out of the hat. I think Colin would have been a good culprit. And then Margarita also would have been a perfectly fine culprit too. Like, she had the motivation. She's super greedy. And, Colin has a history of lying and art theft. That would have worked well. Whereas Helena, it did feel like she's like, oh, they picked a name out of a hat, and she doesn't quite fit as the culprit, but she does a really good job at the ending. She really sells the fact that she's the culprit. It's a good ending, where she's wearing Nancy's locket, and she's like, what are you, a cop? and she swears revenge, and that was really good. And so that makes me like her as a culprit. The overall is she's too unexpected of a culprit. I don't think that worked, but the ending she really did. And so I mean, I'm thinking about like game number 3 and game number 4, where I said the ending with the culprit was okay. I don't really like the culprit. But if those games had stronger endings where the culprit was far more intimidating, like in Phantom of Venice, then I would have liked those culprits more. As it is, like Phantom of Venice, I really thought Helena was sort of a non-interesting character throughout pretty much the entire game until she's revealed as the culprit. And then she gets way more interesting, and she really sells the fact that she's a villainous person. And it ends with her saying, you know, off Weeder's, nope, that's not the right game. Anyway, she threatens to see Nancy again. She promises to get revenge, and that has stuck out in my mind and a lot of people's minds. They want her to return as a culprit in another Nancy Drew game. And, you know, game number 20 would have been fine if she had been the secret criminal mastermind of that game. In fact, it probably would have been a lot better if she had been the secret criminal mastermind of game number 20. I will not get to that quite yet. We're getting to Haunting at Castle Malloy. He's not really a culprit. The culprit is the old lady who lives in the bog, who has mental issues. She can't really speak or anything, Fiona, because she's been isolated by herself for decades upon decades. And so she's not really a culprit in the fact that she's, you know, purposely kidnapping Matt out of any evil intention. She was just doing what she thought was right. And this is another game where I feel like game number 8, you know, the Haunted Carousel, where if you follow the story, there's really only one person who the culprit could be. It has to be Fiona. There's no one else who it could be. Nobody else fits the description. Unless you're going to say, oh, Kyler is for whatever reason disguising herself as a banshee and flying around. No, there's only one person who could have done the banshee deception, and that was Fiona. And so it had to have been her. Yeah, it is kind of unfortunate that, it's cool that Nancy's being haunted by a real banshee. That's the premise of the game, right? But it doesn't tie enough to Matt being kidnapped, because Fiona did not kidnap Matt on purpose. And that is what some people think is sort of like a weaker link of the game. Yeah, so who else could... I don't think Denal could have been the culprit. It would have been funny. Oh, man, imagine that culprit confrontation. That would have been good. Like, even the culprit confrontation as it is, Nancy is surprisingly scared. Like, I don't think we've seen Nancy react with that much fear to a culprit before. She's like, oh my gosh, you're Fiona, aren't you? Fiona Malloy? I'm sorry, I shouldn't be here. I'll leave. Yeah. And it's not really a back and forth conversation, because Fiona just sort of grunts at you the whole time. And so that wasn't so good. So I'd say with Fiona, I don't know who else could have been the culprit. Maybe this would have been a case like Secret of the Old Clock, where we have like a secondary culprit. So we say Fiona's the culprit who's responsible for the Banshee stuff, and then we have the real culprit who kidnapped Matt. If the game had gone that route, I think it would have been just fine. Would have been just fine, yeah. Okay, after that is game number 20, Ransom of the Seven Ships. So like Creature of Kapu Cave, the fact that the game is not good overall kind of ruins the culprit thing, because it's so easy to know who the culprit is. He's the only character of the game. He's your only suspect. Therefore, he's the culprit. And I thought it was weird how Johnny Roll, he's actually John Poo from Australia. So that's an optional subplot where he reveals he's actually John Poole in disguise. I thought that was weird. It didn't really fit the game, and it doesn't seem to fulfill any narrative purpose at all. I don't know why they included that. And then again, he's like, oh, well, he's in disguise again. So he's in disguise as being in disguise as someone in disguise. That just doesn't make sense, because we know he's the culprit. There are literally no other options. But it is a fun culprit reveal where Nancy doesn't recognize Dwayne, and then she's like, John? Don, Dewey, Dick, Drake? She just suggests all the names starting with the letter D, because she's pretty sure his name starts with a D. It's like, it's Dwayne, you idiot! Dwayne Powers. Really wish they'd gotten the original Dwayne Powers voice actor back. He does try being super dramatic. He does make the dramatic pose. It's like, yes! It was sheer genius! But, yeah. No, I don't think... I really did think it was fun to have Dwayne come back, and that confrontation is good, but yeah, I feel like it would have been better if it had been someone else. Like I said, if it had been Helena, that would have been perfectly fine. I feel like Shorty, that's the one that I've currently been thinking of, is Shorty would have made for a much better villain in terms of the culprit plot. Because Shorty likes gold and hidden treasure. That's an established fact. Whereas Dwayne, it's like, when did Dwayne, like, yeah, like, when was Dwayne's primary motivation? His motivation was not finding money. It was revenge. I don't know. He doesn't really fit, and it doesn't really, yeah. They tried to do it in a way that you could still understand it if you hadn't played game number 2, but then that just leaves the culprit reveal as totally disconnected from game number 2. And that's not so good. There's also the fact that, you know, the game has been discontinued because of the culprit reveal, because Dwayne Powers was basically doing blackface while disguising him, you know, that's his disguise as somebody who's a native Jamaican. And that's not good at all. So if the culprit had been somebody else, that would have worked much better. If it had been Shorty just doing an Australian accent and not wearing that disguise, it would have been better. So, I don't know. I really like Dwayne more in his original form. He was not as dramatic in this game as he was in his original one, but it's still kind of fun to see him again. Game number 21. Ooh, Warnings at Waverly. Yeah, that's a game where lots of characters, they all probably would have been really good as the culprit. Like Izzy as the culprit. Yeah, I would like Leela as the culprit too. Oh, the drama if, you know, if Mel had been the culprit, right? Or the Rachel, that would have been interesting too. Still, I think Corrine made for a very good culprit, and it was really great, that culprit confrontation. I believe I've mentioned this before, but the graphics in that culprit confrontation look really good. She looks different from the way she normally appears in the game. She actually looks a lot better because we're getting a close-up on her. Sort of the opposite of Ghost Dogs in Moon Lake, where during that culprit confrontation she looks odd. But here it's like, oh, we're getting a different view of the character because the character is the culprit. She looks a lot better. Crean made for a good culprit. I liked, it's very well choreographed, the ending, where she like walks around and makes poses and looks angry and expressive. And I really do like the ending too, where Mel's like, you just came in through the wall. I want an explanation. You just came in, what did she say? She specifically says, you came into my room through the wall. I don't know. It was a really great ending. I really did like Warnings at Waverly Academy. It's a great game, and it does a good job of giving everybody a full and complete storyline. Arguably, you could say Layla's storyline wasn't completed, but the next game, Trail of the Twister, not so good. So that's the thing where they tried to give everybody a full and complete storyline, but by the time you reach the end of the game, all the storylines are done, really. So, you know, we've got Frosty. We've done the storyline with Frosty. We figured out what's going on with him, selling footage on the sly, and he's doing that with... Oh, man, it's hard to remember the characters from the game. And then there's the Chase who lives in the garage. We've got his storyline of looking for oil. I don't know. It's one of those games where it's like, well, all the characters have resolved storylines at the end of the game. Scott's the only one who really is still open-ended. We don't have a resolution for him. Therefore, he must be the culprit. That was in my mind when I was playing this game, and I was right. It's also a game where the ending is not really explained very well. It's kind of confusing. And, you know, Debbie talks at you for like 2 minutes explaining the story. Scott makes for an okay disgruntled villain. I don't really like the part where he suddenly magically knows that a tornado is coming just by sensing the air. It's like the opening number from the musical Cats. Are you tense when you sense there's a storm in the air? Maybe that was Scott's motivation. Maybe he's really a big fan of the musical Cats. Maybe. Yeah, so Scott, I really, he's a good character. I don't think he works as a villain. I don't know who would have worked as a villain. I think most of the characters in the game are just kind of bland. So, and Scott's the villain in the book, so you might as well leave him as the villain, but I would have redone it, made him more villainous. He does, like, leave Nancy to die, which is, ugh. Yeah, I don't know, I still feel like the game was not entirely written with Scott in view as the culprit, or that everything had been worked out. It felt like they were kind of working out the story as they go along. Maybe it's the case, like, they did each day of the game separately, and that's why they're working out the entire game. They literally were working out the story as they went along, and that's why it feels like the story wasn't really satisfying. There's, you know, like with Nancy, like with Frosty and Debbie, I swear, I'm doing a Culprit review video. I'm not complaining about the games or reviewing them, but like Frosty and Debbie's conversation at the end of like the first day of the game, and that gets ignored until the very end. It's like, that was not so good. And stuff like that. You know, like the Brooke and Scott secretly conspiring with each other. That's another thing. It's like, and that's sort of what I meant when I said, well, there was an unresolved storyline with Scott, and Scott's disappeared. That's also an unresolved storyline with him. Anyway, enough about that game. Game number 23 is Shadow at the Water's Edge. That's another game where I feel like the culprit had to have been Rentaro, because he was the only one with the technical know-how to be able to pull off that crime. It had to be him. So it's definitely one of those cases where he had to be the villain, which is sad because he's sort of a nice and friendly guy. I did not like the culprit confrontation very much. At the end, it's an okay puzzle where you have to pick two things, but it doesn't seem, it seems like he's acting out of character. Like it's like, it doesn't seem like that matches with the way he acted throughout the entire game. It feels like he's only pretending to be the villain, if that makes sense. Like he's just play acting as villain, as opposed to actually being a legitimate villain. Even though he does things right. It's like, he does the dramatic pose. It's like, soon I will get to move to Tokyo. And yeah, I do like how we do get two possible endings. We can get him in trouble, or we can redeem him as make it seem like things just got out of hand, that's all. So it is nice we have that option. That option does come back in Sea of Darkness as well. And I think I've mentioned other games where it's like, well, you can kind of tell, it's like, well, is this a villainous culprit, or is it more a culprit you can sympathize with? I kind of prefer the villainous culprits at the end of the game myself, but that's just me. 24, Captive Curse. Perfectly fine. I don't think it could have been Lucas. Could have been, is it Marcus? No. Marcus is the head of security. Carl, the Burgermeister. He was way too incompetent to be the villain. And Renata, it doesn't seem like Renata would have been up to being the villain, too, because she stays in place and sleeps very easily. That's all she does. She doesn't seem like the kind of person who'd be running around in the woods in a costume. So it sort of has to be Anya by default. She has to be the culprit because none of the other characters really fit. She has a good long-term plan. It's really dramatic, and they do set up the fact that she wants revenge on Marcus. Marcus, he's the castle owner, that's right. So she wants revenge on him, Marcus Baum. Yeah. So, I mean, they do a good job of setting it up, and she makes for a great culprit. I like the culprit reveal at the end. There are pieces of her plan that doesn't make sense, but it's another long-term... Like, she knocks Nancy unconscious and then throws Nancy into a pit. And then Nancy escapes from the pit. And then it's like, oh, now I'm actually going to have a conversation with you. It's like, well, I don't know. And they kind of ignore the fact that Nancy was thrown into a pit. She threatened to get revenge on Nancy and to appear in another game. That's the other culprit, I believe, who threatened to get revenge and show up in another game. And she's also memorable for that way. So I did like her as the culprit. Oh man, what's game number 25? Alibi and Ashes. Great. I actually like that. Yeah, it's a good game. I really like that game, and I think Brenda Carlton makes for a great villain. Tony is kind of revealed as a villain too. I think both of them worked well as villains in this game, and it's just a funny ending where Brenda gets attacked on TV. It's great, and like Brenda's kind of an antagonist villain in the 1980s books, so it works for her to be like the villain of this game, because that was probably the first time her character had appeared in the Nancy Drew universe in like 10 years. So they bring her back to give her, resolution as a villain. It was great. Yeah, no, I feel like she did a good job. It's more kind of, it's really scary how the townspeople rise up and all hate Nancy. That's kind of more worrying than the fact that somebody's deliberately trying to sabotage Nancy's good name in the press. It's like Nancy just turns around and forgives her neighbors who threw bricks through her window. A gift basket doesn't cut it, Karen. I don't know. Yeah. Anyway. So, yeah, I think she made for a good villain. I don't know who else. Deirdre Shannon would have made for a good villain too, but I like Deirdre as she appears in the other games in the series, so I'm glad she wasn't the villain, because she wouldn't have been able to show up in the other games. She was fun in Midnight in Salem and the Deadly Device. So yeah. Game number 26. That's Tomb of the Lost Queen. That is... I don't know. It's interesting because I've said I've liked certain villains that were over the top and did like dramatic poses like but I said, hey, that was great when Taylor Sinclair did it. That was great when Dwayne Powers did it. Even great when Helena did it, because she really sold me on that. But I've also felt like there are characters that it didn't work for. Like, they're too over the top. So, like I said, I didn't think Rentaro being the dramatic, scary villain worked. And here with Abdullah, he's a little too over the top cartoony. I feel like maybe if Nancy had a confrontation with him, like had a conversation with him, that would have worked. I feel, yeah, if this had been a game where she actually got to talk to him for a bit, that probably would have been better. Instead, it's more like Curse of Blackmoor Manor with Jane, where the character gives a minor lecture and then leaves, and he's like, haha, good, for once I do not have to explain it to you. Mwahaha, I am leaving now. And then that's it. That's basically all the explanation we get. So yeah, I feel like we definitely needed more explanation. I did like it was scary at the end where he tries to attack Nancy. He's like, leaving so soon? And then John attacks him from behind. So that was really good. I like that ending. But I didn't really like Abdullah as a character overall. Like, of all the... Well, no. I was about to say of all the characters of the game, he's my least favorite. But that would actually be Jamila. But Abdullah spends most of the game bragging about himself and saying weird things that don't make sense. And so I just did not like his character at all. I did not get into the storyline of him fighting with Lily, which sort of ties into this ending where he's forcing Lily to work as his evil goon who's doing his misdeeds. Yeah, I did not like... Yeah, did not work for me, so no, sorry Abdullah. Game number 27. Deadly Device. Perfectly fine. I like the ending. I actually liked it. It works really well. There are, like, problems with the ending. Like, it makes no sense that Victor walks out in the middle of the Tesla coil. It's on... The Tesla coil is running. You use that to murder somebody. You're currently in the process of using it to murder another person, but he still steps out in the middle of this very deadly area while the deadly device is on. That makes no sense. It was a terrible idea on Victor's part. How is he that dumb? He does give a really long, thorough explanation of all his misdeeds and the story throughout the game, and that's something I feel like would have been helpful with Abdullah. So, and he makes for an intimidating villain too, because he basically attacks everyone one by one. Now, you could argue that it's like game number 23, like the Trail of the Twister, where it's like, okay, everybody's storyline has been resolved except for Victor, therefore Victor's the culprit. And you could argue that's the case there. Okay. But other than that, I think he makes for a good culprit. Yeah, it's definitely memorable. Game number 28. Is that Silent Spy, or is that Ghost of Thornton Hall? Well, I'll talk about both of them. Ghost of Thornton Hall's culprit was... Well, there are like 3 different culprits, aren't there? Because we got 3 different endings. So, one ending... Well, basically in all the endings, it's indicated Clara's the culprit, in that she's the one who is responsible for killing Scarlet all those years ago. She started the fire because Scarlet cut her out of the will. And that's pretty dramatic. That works because she's a very cold, intimidating person, and it does fit the game. It is annoying in her ending where you get the choice to save her, and she spends the entire time whining instead of helping you solve the puzzle. So I'm trying to focus and concentrate on the puzzle, and she's like, I sat at your graveside for a year! A year! Haven't you had enough? Can't you leave me alone? Why are you so upset? Like, seriously, it's been 10 years. I killed you 10 years ago. Don't I get a pass on it by now? Yeah. It wasn't 10 years. It was more like 15, 20 years. It was a long time ago. Colton still remembers that night. I don't know, because she wasn't the one who kidnapped Jessalyn. Jessalyn wasn't actually kidnapped. Jessalyn sort of kidnapped herself with the help of Harper. And that storyline doesn't... It makes sense, but at the same time, it doesn't make sense. Like, they sort of foiled their own plan, in a sense. Like, they could have done the exact same thing without pretending to kidnap Jessalyn. In fact, their plan might have worked just as fine if Jessalyn had not fake kidnapped herself. But you also have those really serious downer endings where it's like, okay, house burned down, nobody's seen Harper, nobody's seen Clara. Yeah. Savannah doesn't like me anymore. That's a really downer ending, yeah. So, Clara works as a culprit for the game, though. I think overall, put her in this area, like, like halfway between good and halfway. So, like, 75% culprit. Nancy really didn't get a chance to talk to Clara. I feel like that's it. Nancy and Clara didn't have much of a discussion there about what happened. And I really would like more details on what happened. Why did Scarlet write Clara out of the will? That's a big question that doesn't really get answered, does it? Yeah, how did Clara find out about it? Yeah. I guess it's one of those games where they're just sort of juggling 2 stories. Sort of like, game number 19, Haunting of Castle Malloy, where we've got the kidnapping story before a wedding. Hey, that's exactly like Ghost of Thornton Hall, actually. And then we've also got the story with Fiona and, the Banshee, which is similar to Ghost of Thornton Hall, because the other story is with the ghost and, yeah, Charlotte's Ghost, isn't it? Huh. Yeah, those 2 games are a lot more similar than I thought. I never thought of that before. That's interesting. Well... Anyway, yeah, I know a lot of people don't like the ending of Ghost of Thornton Hall where it said, oh, the ghost wasn't real, it was just carbon monoxide hallucination. And that felt like an excuse. It didn't feel like it fit the game very well. They did sort of make a deal about the furnace in the basement. Harper mentions it. Like, Nancy's like, hey, isn't this kind of dangerous? And Harper's like, that's an upstairs person problem. I'm more of a downstairs person. But still, yeah, Yeah, it felt like they just wanted to go out and the ghost stuff, and then that's like, that explanation really strains the limits of believability. Oh my gosh, I've been talking for an hour. It's okay, I'm pretty close to the end of the series now. Okay, so after Ghost of Thornton Hall, we have game number 30. Thumbs down, terrible culprit, does not make sense, bad game. It's just like Cruiser of Kapu Cave, where it's like, well, the game is bad, and the culprit explanation is bad, and that just really hurts the culprit reveal. At the end, we barely get to talk to Kiri at the end of the game. She's like, it was making you pay for your betrayal. That's the explanation we get for the culprit stuff. And that doesn't work. That doesn't make sense. It's... Why? There was no betrayal. Nancy doesn't meet Kiri until after George's attack. So why did Kiri attack George? It would have worked better if the game had gone with the explanation that Kiri was just trying to win the competition because she wants to be TV famous. That fits her... That fits Kiri's personality a lot better. It goes along with the ending, because the ending is like her doing that culprit pose, and the title says like Queen of TV, dethroned, or something like that. And yeah, so really, it was not thought out at all. Really, it was terrible. And let me go back to the Silent Spy. I just realized I skipped over that. Sorry, I got distracted saying I've been talking for an hour. So with the Silent Spy, again, terrible culprit reveal. There was no thought put into it whatsoever. The explanation is, because I can. And that's it. So like those two games, really terrible culprits. The game would have been a lot better if the culprit stuff had been thought out. I feel maybe they wrote themselves into a corner because they had to find a way to tie in the death of Nancy's mother to the Revenant attack, to the current Revenant terrorist attack of releasing chemical agents all over the city. And, I mean, that's a problem. I think in general the game does a fairly good job of tying in the events of Nancy's mother and her investigation into what's going on in the current day, but it does fail in terms of what exactly happened when Nancy's mother died. What happened that day? Where was she? We do get some explanation for it, but we don't... I mean, I thought we were getting a lot more details, like Nancy's mother died here. This is the person who murdered her. That sort of thing. Instead, it's like, well, Nancy foils the current plot and just kind of gives up on investigating who really killed her mother. It's still left that it's just, well, it's the terrorist organization. That's basically it. She didn't have any cover, and so the terrorists got her. And yeah, I don't know, because we did get those audio messages from Mom. Like, these are messages on the day Mom died. I thought we would get a lot more in that sense. I'm sorry, I got off topic. I'm complaining about the game. Ewan makes for a bad culprit. I think he makes for a bad character in general. I think they were trying to make him a funny character, like a quirky character, and that did not work. Like the joke, oh, he likes solitaire, ha ha ha. That joke was not funny at all. And, well, it's kind of funny the first time around. Yeah, he did not work as a character for me in general. And the culprit reveal does nothing. It does not build on his character. It's a very short thing where it like I said, it's basically just one line. He's like, why are you doing this? Because I can. And that's it. We don't really, as Nancy says in the end of game story, it's like we don't really know how Revenant got a hold of him or what they were planning. It sounds like he's just a low-level guy who felt useless and they preyed on that. It's like, oh, okay. Really would have liked more explanation for him, more closure for that. Yeah, and just the same thing for Kiri. She's one of those characters who I didn't like throughout the game. And then the culprit revelation was so bad, it was basically just the one line, making you pay for your betrayal. And that's it. So she was not redeemed in my eyes by the fact that she's the culprit. That did not make her a more interesting character. She remained as a very badly done character, as opposed to like I said, games number 3 and 4, where Louis Chandler, I thought he was kind of I didn't like him as a character, but he's at least memorable for being the culprit. Same with Lisa, but with Kiri and Ewan, they were not memorable characters. The fact that they're the culprit doesn't make them any more memorable. They remain kind of bad characters. I was going to say kind of that's the case for Creature of Kapu, but not really. I think Big Nike is actually kind of a cool character. He was an interesting, memorable character. I just wish his culprit thing had been done. Yeah, like, the culprit thing doesn't help or hurt him. I think it even kind of hurts his character. Like, it would have been better if he had not been the culprit of that game. I think he was good enough to stand on his own. Yeah. Anyway, game number 31, Labyrinth of Lies. So that's another game where, like Phantom of Venice, it's like, oh, everybody is the culprit. Well, there's multiple people working on the culprit thing. I didn't like that so well. Really, the two culprits are Thanos, and Thanos is a cartoonishly bad villain. He's like, Nancy captures him in a cage and he starts barking at her because it's like, oh, we're in Hades. The dog of death, Cerebus, has 3 heads. Her. Like, he starts barking at her and then he disappears. How did he disappear? We don't know. And he later escapes from jail. How did he escape? I don't know. Maybe he's got, it's suggested it's like he's got these criminal underworld connections. I think you can even miss out on that storyline with the Hardy Boys calling them, getting the criminal connection background, that he's connected to the Greek mafia. He is intimidating during the first part of the game, and so it works to have him as a villain in that sense, but he's got nothing going for him other than the fact that he's scary looking and intimidating. That's all. He doesn't have really any personality or character development or anything going on story-wise. He's just standing underneath the stage, doing nothing all day long. At least Gregor is doing stuff. Like, he's trying to work on the system, or Xenia is trying to work on the play and prepping for that. Yeah. I mean, it's fairly typical in Nancy Drew games for characters to be standing around doing nothing for the entire game. Thanos, he basically, yeah, he really exemplifies standing around doing nothing, and he's got nothing to do. And so it doesn't quite work when he's the culprit, because he hasn't done anything. He's just scary, that's all. I said there are 2 culprits in this game, Thanos and Xenia. Xenia makes for a great culprit. I like her culprit reveal. That's fantastic, where she's like, I'm the one who's been pulling the strings all along. Ha 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 ha. I really do like that. I like her dramatic culprit revelation, and she's like, I'm queen of the underworld. And that works a lot better than, I'm the mean doggy in the front of the underworld. Bark, bark, bark. So, Thanos, yeah, actually, you know, Thanos, maybe give him 25% because he is definitely intimidating. But Xenia, like, that was really fantastic. They have some just great shots of her walking through the pool of fire. Well, she turns on the fire after she leaves. She doesn't walk through fire. It would have been cool if she had, though, right? Like, whew, scary. Yeah. But then at the very end, where Nancy goes up on stage, where Nancy interrupts the play and she goes on stage, Thanos is like, think carefully, girl. And Xenia goes, Hades, get her out of here. That was not scary or intimidating. I did like Nancy interrupting the play, but like, that does not do anything for the culprits. They seem a lot worse. They seem like worse, less threatening culprits now, because we saw them basically trying to pretend to be nice people for the audience, really. So, yeah. Yeah. Maybe it would have worked, but I mean, Nancy does talk to those culprits a little bit, but maybe not enough. It feels like Gregor had more character development. Like, the story was definitely more concerned with Gregor's story and Niobe's story. And Niobe also has the problem that a lot of the characters do, where they seem to be talking in half-truths and riddles, and it's hard to understand what they're saying. Sunny June had that problem. Although with him, it was usually for humorous effects. As I said, Abdullah had that problem too. So that didn't quite work there with Niobe, because it's like, okay, I want to treat you as a sympathetic villain, but I have no idea what you're talking about. And Gregor, I don't think he quite plays well enough as the role of he's somebody who's in over his head, because he's just too confident and in charge for the first half of the game, whereas the second half of the game, it doesn't kind of fit. Then again, he is an actor. It makes sense that he's able to be confident. I don't know. I can see why people complain. They don't like that ending. It's like, if there had been a game, another game, with that ending, where all the characters are guilty, that would have worked better. Maybe not Labyrinth of Lies. If Labyrinth of Lies had just been Xenia as the culprit, fine. Fantastic. I would have liked that. What game would have been good with all the culprits? All the characters are culprits working together. I don't know. I can't think of it off the top of my head. Sorry. You can leave comments letting me know which game you think would be great if everyone was the culprit. Maybe one of those games where they had two culprits, you know, like Secret of the Old Clock, as I said, or Haunting a Castle Malloy. If everybody was in on the plot in those games, yeah. So next game, Sea of Darkness. You know, Soren, he was an okay villain. Yeah, I think he was okay. He was a memorable enough character that if he wasn't the culprit, I would still remember him. He was interesting. He did have his tragic villain backstory. I don't think Elizabeth would have been a very good villain. I think Gunnar would have been a great villain. He would have been scary and intimidating. He's a large guy who carries a knife around with him at all times. Whereas with Soren, he kind of becomes extra intimidating. You know, he's got an axe, and until that moment, he's never been a really intimidating, scary character. Really, in fact, he was the guy who got beat up by Gunnar. Yeah, even Dagny. Yeah, Dagny had like the fake blood and stuff earlier when she faked her own kidnapping, so we know she could be pretty serious. She would have been an okay villain too, although I don't think she would have kidnapped Magnus. That's the one part where it doesn't quite make sense. But they definitely do try to make Soren more of a sympathetic villain. We do have the ending where you can decide whether to go easy on him or to bring the full force of the law on him. So I think he's okay. I still think Gunnar or Dagny would have been a better villain. Yeah, it doesn't seem like Soren works. Like I said, he needs to have the axe in order to be intimidating, because by himself he's not intimidating enough. It doesn't seem like he would be able to keep Magnus hostage. It feels like in real life, if Soren had tried to attack Magnus would have knocked him out in like an instant. We're talking about Magnus who punches his way through an ice wall, and this is like after being kidnapped for 3 days, surviving on basically bread and water. So, yeah. I don't know. Soren would have been a fine a villain in maybe another game. But he would have been an A+ villain in another game. In this game, he's just like a B+ villain. So still good, but definitely not the character I wanted to see as the villain. Maybe part of that is because he's also so sympathetic that he doesn't quite work as a villain. As I said, I do like the evil villains. The evil dramatic villains. Okay, and then finally Midnight in Salem, which is... Oh, man. I don't like the villain reveal at the end of the game at all. Somebody just complained at me that the end of the game is not so good in that we have a good confrontation with the culprit. Like, we go inside the office. It's like Nancy bursts into the judge's office, and she's going to get the judge to at the very last second. It's almost midnight in Salem, and the judge is about to sign the order. So Nancy bursts in at the last second and reveals the culprit. And I am totally blanking on her name. Is it Alicia? It's Alicia, right? And, you know, that's a dramatic setup. And it's good for like the first 5 minutes, but then it just keeps going and going and going, which is the problem with Midnight in Salem. Nobody ever stops talking. They're like me. I've been talking for over an hour now, probably an hour and a half. This is going to be a super long video. Hope you guys enjoy it. It is like, you know, this is a great way to celebrate 15 years of Argo Fumps, right? Super long video, huh? But it just goes on and on and on. And so if the culprit confrontation had been limited to 5 to 10 minutes max, it would have been much better. Instead, it just keeps going. And she does have the weird line. She's like, why don't you guys run away before your PB&Js get cold? And that's supposed to be like a dismissive thing, but it's like, gosh, that line doesn't make sense. And she's just constantly complaining. It feels like everybody in the room wanted to have their own 5-minute segment where they talk to the culprit, and that just did not work. Yeah, so she would have been a good villain if that ending had been better. And then the game, does the game really address it must address the part at the end where Alicia just kind of comes out of nowhere and floods the tunnels and tries to kill Nancy and May. But yeah, I feel like there's also the fact that the fire at the Hathorn house was not Alicia's fault. That was Tegan's fault. And so it's another game where, you know, we kind of have two culprits in that sense. I feel like because of that, Alicia's role as the main culprit feels lessened because she had nothing to do with the fire. And, you know, her only real crime was trying to poison her own client until the end where she, you know, releases the floodgates and tries to drown Nancy and May. Yeah, well, I guess she did plot to have the Book of Apologies stolen. She's basically been blackmailing Jason, so she's been doing that, yeah. So it's a game that kind of tries to juggle the multiple culprits thing, while at the same time trying to clearly having Alicia as the main culprit. I feel like it just is. The problems that are inherent with the game are the problems that are not, that plague her as a culprit. But is she way better than Ewan as a culprit? Definitely. Is she way better than Kiri? 100%. Yeah, but still, I feel like, yeah, that culprit confrontation, like, it should have been way, way shorter. Just way shorter instead of going on for so long to the point where it's like, I'm bored. Can we just arrest her and get on with the end of the game? And, yeah. There's also the fact that, you know, in day number 3 of the game, where Jason is revealed as the culprit, that felt like it fell a little flat too, because we clearly see him in the video footage. That's clearly Jason, and it still takes like an hour before Nancy realizes Jason's the culprit, because she just happens to find this ticket in his car, which she just happens to take, and yeah, very dramatic. The ending was sort of like they were trying to go for maximum drama, and they did a good job on that, but I feel like it could have been rewritten to make more sense, and especially should have been rewritten so that it didn't go on forever and ever and ever. Okay. Alright, so I'm done. Unless you want me to talk about the Dossier games. Dossier number 1, the culprit that's just a repeat of game number 13. It works, but it is just a repeat of game number 13. Very clearly just copy-pasting that storyline. So that was not so good. But it did work. It did work in the context of the game. Dossier number 2, any of the culprits could have been the game. All the suspects have their own culprit ending. So that works as well. I think the most common culprits are... I think it's Cassidy and Mrs. Montague are the people that are work best as the culprit, and you know, they're the people that most characters see as the culprits, as opposed to Helfton, who I don't really, like when he's the culprit in the end, it doesn't really quite fit. It's like it's another case of, oh, now I'm pretending to be an evil bad guy, and it doesn't really work that well. Okay, so thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed my video. Bye, everybody.